At 2 a.m., the Queen stopped breathing. By sunrise, the King of England had fled in terror, abandoning her corpse. What came next would turn a powerful monarch into a paranoid, broken tyrant. You're about to witness a king's descent into madness. But first, if you crave the darkest corners of history that no one talks about, smash that subscribe button and join the Dark Reigns family. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. October 24th, 1537. Hampton Court Palace. This is the night that shattered Henry VIII and changed England forever. October 12th, 1537. Hampton Court Palace. After 2 days and 3 nights of agonizing labor, Queen Jane Seymour finally delivered what Henry VIII had desperately wanted for 28 years. A living, breathing male heir. The baby boy, christened Edward, arrived into a world that had been holding its breath. Church bells rang across London. Bonfires blazed in celebration. 2,000 rounds of gunshot echoed from the tower. England had its prince. But in the birthing chamber, something had gone terribly wrong. The labor had been brutal. The baby's position was poor, making delivery nearly impossible without intervention. Jane's physicians had done what they could with the limited tools of Tudor medicine, but the damage was done. Her body, exhausted and torn from the ordeal, now faced an invisible enemy that no one in 1537 understood: infection. For the first few days, Jane seemed to recover. She was weak, certainly, but alive. Court officials began planning her churching ceremony, the traditional ritual where a new mother would return to public life and give thanks for surviving childbirth. Letters were drafted announcing the joyous news to foreign courts. Henry visited her chambers, proud and relieved. His queen had succeeded where 2 others had failed. Then, on October 16th, 4 days after Edward's birth, Jane developed what court records described as a natural lax, severe diarrhea that physicians initially dismissed as simple food poisoning. Perhaps something she ate disagreed with her weakened system. Perhaps it was just part of recovery. They gave her remedies, kept her comfortable, and waited. They didn't know they were watching sepsis take hold. Modern medical historians now believe that retained placenta tissue, left behind during that difficult delivery, had created a breeding ground for bacteria deep inside Jane's body. The infection began locally, quietly multiplying in the warm darkness. By the time symptoms appeared on October 16th, deadly microorganisms had already begun their invasion. Within 3 days, by October 19th, the infection had entered her bloodstream. Septic shock, a condition that would remain mysterious and untreatable for another 3 centuries, had begun its final, merciless work. Jane's body temperature spiked and plummeted. Her heart raced, trying desperately to pump blood through vessels that were collapsing. Her organs, one by one, began to fail. The royal physicians surrounded her bed, helpless. They had all the authority and prestige in England, but none of the knowledge they needed. They administered herbs, performed bloodletting, prayed fervently. Nothing worked. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, using weapons that had no effect. In a private chamber down the corridor, baby Edward slept peacefully in his cradle, surrounded by nurses and rockers who sang him lullabies. He would never remember his mother. He would never know that his arrival into this world had set in motion the sequence of events that would kill her. The countdown had begun. Jane Seymour had 5 days left to live. Those final 5 days moved with cruel slowness for everyone except Jane. By October 20th, the truth was undeniable. The Queen of England was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The cheerful preparations for her churching ceremony were quietly abandoned. The celebratory atmosphere that had filled Hampton Court turned heavy with dread. Courtiers spoke in whispers. Servants moved through corridors with bowed heads. Even the autumn air outside seemed to grow colder. Henry VIII visited her chambers obsessively during those last days, watching helplessly as the woman who had finally given him a son slipped away. For a king who controlled the fate of nations, who had broken with Rome itself to bend the world to his will, this powerlessness must have been unbearable. Death didn't care about his authority. Death couldn't be intimidated, negotiated with, or executed. Jane drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was lucid, she spoke weakly to those gathered around her bed. When fever consumed her, she muttered things no one could understand. The infection, what Tudor physicians called childbed fever, had won. In an era centuries before antibiotics, before anyone even understood that bacteria existed, puerperal fever was a death sentence. It killed with methodical efficiency, and it killed thousands of women every year. On October 24th, as midnight approached, Jane's breathing became labored. The women attending her knew what this meant. They had seen it before. They sent word through the palace that the end was near. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Queen Jane Seymour took her final breath. She was 29 years old. She had been Queen of England for 17 months. She had been a mother for 12 days. The chronicler Edward Hall, who documented the Tudor court with meticulous detail, would later write that the lamentation for Queen Jane's death was heard throughout the realm. But his most telling observation was this: of no one was her death more heavily taken than of the King's Majesty himself. The rooms of Hampton Court were immediately draped in black fabric. The joyous palace that had celebrated a prince's birth less than 2 weeks earlier transformed into a house of mourning. Candles were lit, prayers were murmured, and somewhere in those dark corridors, Henry VIII confronted a kind of loss he had never experienced before. He had divorced Catherine of Aragon, that had been his choice. He had ordered Anne Boleyn's execution again, his decision, his control. But Jane's death was different. He hadn't chosen this. He couldn't undo it. He couldn't bend this reality to his will, no matter how much power he possessed. And Henry VIII, who spent his entire life avoiding illness and death with obsessive fear, now stood in a palace with a corpse. His wife's corpse, the mother of his son's corpse. What happened next would reveal just how fragile the king's mind truly was. By sunrise on October 24th, Henry VIII was gone. He didn't wait for the formal preparations. He didn't oversee the respectful laying out of Jane's body. He didn't comfort the weeping ladies-in-waiting who had served his queen faithfully. He simply fled Hampton Court Palace as if something were chasing him, because something was his own terror of death. Throughout his life, Henry had displayed an almost pathological fear of mortality. During plague outbreaks, he would flee London immediately, sometimes moving between residences every few days to stay ahead of the contagion. He couldn't bear to be near the sick. The very concept of disease sent him into panic. And now, death itself had entered his palace, had taken his wife, had contaminated the very air he breathed. So he ran. Court documents from the Herald College record that the king retired to a solitary place to pass his sorrows. That place was Esher Place, a quiet manor far from Hampton Court's now tainted halls. Here, away from curious eyes and pitying faces, Henry confronted his grief alone. But solitude offered no comfort. Within days, he moved again, this time to Westminster Palace, where chroniclers noted he mourned and kept himself close and secret a great while. Close and secret. Those words reveal everything. The King of England, the most public figure in the realm, had withdrawn completely from the world. He refused audiences. He wouldn't speak to courtiers. Even his closest advisers found themselves shut out. One contemporary account described how he would not be spoken to by anyone after Jane's death, an extraordinary statement about a monarch whose entire existence revolved around being accessible to his council and court. Left behind at Hampton Court, the grim machinery of a royal funeral began without him. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, stepped in as Earl Marshal to coordinate the arrangements. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief secretary and most trusted administrator, handled the political and logistical nightmares that came with the Queen's sudden death. These men had served Henry for years, had witnessed his marriages and divorces, his triumphs and rages. But they had never seen him like this. The king who had coldly orchestrated Anne Boleyn's execution just 17 months earlier could not face Jane Seymour's corpse for even a moment. The man who had defied the Pope, dissolved monasteries, and reshaped England's entire religious landscape was undone by the death of one woman. This wasn't political theater designed to demonstrate his devotion. This wasn't calculated grief for public consumption. This was genuine psychological collapse, witnessed and recorded by multiple sources who had no reason to fabricate such unflattering details about their sovereign. Henry VIII, warrior king, Renaissance prince, supreme head of the Church of England, had been reduced to a broken man hiding in darkened rooms, unable to face the reality of loss. And this was only the beginning. The funeral, the mourning, the aftermath, all of it would reveal depths to Henry's psychological fragility that no one at court had fully understood until now. While Henry hid at Westminster, England mourned publicly. On November 8, 1537, 2 weeks after Jane's death, the Lord Mayor of London issued an extraordinary order. 1,200 masses were to be sung throughout the city for the soul of Queen Jane. 1,200. Churches across the capital filled with the sound of prayers for a woman most Londoners had barely known. Solemn services echoed through cathedrals and parish churches alike. The scale of this religious observance was unprecedented, a clear signal from the crown that this queen's death was to be marked as deeply significant. And Henry himself wore the deepest mourning black, not for days, not for weeks, for 3 entire months. This detail matters because Henry VIII had never mourned any of his previous wives this way. Catherine of Aragon, his wife of 24 years, had died in January 1536. Henry celebrated by dressing in festive yellow. Anne Boleyn's execution in May 1536 was followed by his betrothal to Jane the very next day. But Jane was different. For Jane, he draped himself in black and withdrew from the world. Court mourning extended even longer, until Easter of 1538, more than 5 months after her death. The entire English court functioned in a state of suspended grief, everything dimmed and quieted out of respect for the king's devastation. On November 12, 1537, Jane Seymour's funeral procession made its way to Windsor Castle. Her coffin was carried with full royal honors to St. George's Chapel, where it would be lowered into the vault before the high altar. The ceremony was magnificent, as befitted a Queen of England. Hundreds of mourners attended, dressed in black, their faces solemn. Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, his child, with Catherine of Aragon, served as chief mourner, a position of great importance. Mary walked behind the coffin, leading the procession of noble ladies. Also present were Jane's 2 brothers, Edward Seymour and Thomas Seymour, watching as their sister received a queen's burial. The chapel filled with the sound of Latin prayers and the sweet, heavy scent of incense. But one person was conspicuously absent, Henry himself. Royal tradition dictated that kings did not attend funerals, not even for their wives. It was considered beneath their dignity, a concession to mortality that monarchs couldn't afford to make. So Henry's absence, while expected, also served him perfectly. He didn't have to face the coffin. He didn't have to watch as Jane was sealed away in the vault. Yet before the burial, Henry made one request that would echo through history. When his own time came, he told his advisers he wanted to be buried beside Jane Seymour, not beside Catherine, his first wife, not beside any of the others who would follow. Only Jane. That request revealed something crucial. This wasn't just grief. This was something deeper, more permanent, more psychologically devastating. Jane's death had fractured something fundamental in Henry's mind, and the man who emerged from his months of mourning would be far more dangerous than the one who had entered it. To understand why Jane's death shattered Henry so completely, you need to know what he had already endured. By October 1537, the king was not the robust, athletic monarch he had once been. He was already breaking. See January 24th, 1536. A jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, 44 years old and still determined to prove his vigor, charged down the tilt-yard in full armor. His opponent bore down from the opposite end. The collision should have been controlled. Ceremonial, even these tournaments followed strict protocols. But something went catastrophically wrong. Henry's horse stumbled. The massive armored animal collapsed, and Henry, weighed down by his own heavy plate armor, went down with it. The horse fell directly on top of him, crushing the king beneath its weight. Spectators screamed. Courtiers rushed forward. For 2 hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious while physicians frantically worked to revive him. When he finally woke, something fundamental had changed. The external injuries were obvious. His legs had been damaged in the fall, and old wounds that had previously healed now reopened and refused to close. But the internal damage, the injury to his brain from that catastrophic impact, was invisible. In 1536, no one understood traumatic brain injury. They couldn't see the bruising deep inside Henry's skull, the damaged tissue that would alter his personality forever. Within months, the changes became impossible to ignore. The king, who had once been charming, intellectual, and relatively measured, became someone else entirely. Historian Susanna Lipscomb would later note that Henry became increasingly anxious and irascible, easily irritated, and alarmingly prone to rage. His mood swings grew unpredictable. His temper, once controllable, now flared without warning. His jousting days were over. The injury had ended his ability to participate in the sport he loved. The athletic young king who had once dazzled his court with displays of physical prowess now faced the reality of a body that was failing him. The leg wounds became chronic ulcers, suppurating and emitting foul odors. The pain was constant, excruciating, and it manifested itself in every aspect of his personality. The timeline is chilling when you lay it out clearly. January 1536, the jousting accident. May 1536, just 5 months later, Anne Boleyn was arrested, tried on charges of adultery, and executed. June 1536, Henry married Jane Seymour. October 1537, Jane died. In less than 2 years, Henry had suffered a traumatic brain injury, executed a wife, remarried, fathered a son, and lost the woman who gave him that child. Each trauma layered upon the last, and his injured brain struggled to process any of it properly. By the time Jane drew her last breath, Henry VIII was not a healthy man confronting grief. He was a brain-damaged, chronically ill, psychologically fragile monarch pushed beyond his breaking point. The fall from that horse had been the beginning. Jane's death would be the final crack that broke him completely. But the brain injury was only part of Henry's deterioration. His body was waging its own war against him. The leg wounds from that 1536 fall had initially shown signs of healing, giving false hope to the court physicians. But between 1536 and 1538, the ulceration returned with a vengeance, and this time it wouldn't heal. The wounds festered, suppurating constantly. The smell was reportedly unbearable, rotting flesh that no amount of perfume or herbal poultices could mask. Courtiers learned to stand upwind of their king. The pain must have been extraordinary. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom, make life and death decisions, navigate complex political waters, all while your legs are literally rotting. Every step an agony. Every moment of sitting or standing a reminder that your body is betraying you. This wasn't occasional discomfort. This was relentless, grinding, day-after-day torture that no Tudor medicine could adequately address. Modern medical historians examining Henry's symptoms have identified a likely culprit: undiagnosed and untreated type 2 diabetes. The evidence is compelling. chronic wounds that refuse to heal, classic diabetes symptom, progressive weight gain despite decreased physical activity, another marker. The personality changes, cognitive decline, and vascular problems. Henry displayed all align with long-term uncontrolled diabetes. If this speculation is correct, it means Henry's blood sugar was slowly destroying his body from the inside. His kidneys would have been struggling, his circulation deteriorating, his nerves gradually dying, which might actually explain some of the wound complications. Diabetic neuropathy makes healing nearly impossible. The high blood pressure, the exhaustion, the migraines, he frequently complained about, all pieces of the same devastating puzzle. Some historians have proposed other possibilities. Cushing's syndrome, which causes weight gain and mood disturbances. McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic condition. But regardless of the specific diagnosis, one thing is certain: Henry VIII was seriously, chronically ill during the years surrounding Jane's death. And then there was the psychological burden he carried long before any physical ailment manifested. From age 10, when his older brother Arthur died and he suddenly became heir to the throne, Henry had lived under crushing pressure, the weight of dynastic succession, the constant fear of assassination attempts, the paranoia about poisoning that made him obsessively careful about food preparation, the religious turmoil after breaking with Rome that left him spiritually isolated and politically vulnerable. Every English monarch carried stress, certainly, but Henry's combination of responsibilities was unique. He had made himself supreme head of the Church of England, answering to no higher earthly or spiritual authority. He had defied the Pope, risked war with Catholic Europe, dissolved the monasteries. He had personally reshaped his nation's religion to suit his marital needs. The questions about legitimacy, about whether England had made the right choice, haunted him constantly. So when Jane Seymour died in October 1537, she didn't just leave behind a grieving husband. She left behind a man whose brain was damaged, whose body was failing, whose chronic pain never ceased, and whose psychological reserves were already completely depleted. He was a powder keg. Jane's death was the spark. During those long months of isolation at Westminster, something dangerous happened inside Henry's mind. He began rewriting history. In the silent darkness of his private chambers, with no one to challenge his thoughts, no advisors to offer perspective, Henry reconstructed Jane Seymour into someone she had never actually been. The real woman, complicated, political, occasionally defiant, was slowly erased. In her place emerged a phantom, the perfect queen, the ideal wife, the one true love of his life. It happened almost instantly. The moment Jane died, she became untouchable, sacred, beyond criticism. Every flaw vanished from Henry's memory. Every moment of disagreement disappeared. Had Jane tried to intervene during the Pilgrimage of Grace Rebellion, that massive uprising against Henry's religious reforms? She had. She'd actually gone to her knees before the king, begging him to restore the monasteries and show mercy to the rebels. Henry had responded with fury, reminding her that the last queen who meddled in politics lost her head. It was one of the few times Jane had openly challenged him. But now, that memory evaporated. In Henry's reconstruction, Jane had been perfectly obedient, supportive, submissive in all things. Had she harbored sympathies for the old Catholic ways, the traditions Henry was systematically destroying? Historical evidence suggests she did. The Seymour family had Catholic leanings. Jane herself wore conservative preferences plainly. But Henry's idealized version were no such complications. His phantom Jane was whatever he needed her to be, supportive of his reforms, devoted to his vision, aligned perfectly with his will. This wasn't conscious deception. This was grief transforming into something more dangerous, a delusion that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Psychologists call this complicated grief, a condition where the mourner becomes trapped in an idealized past, unable to process loss in a healthy way. The grief becomes part of their identity, unchangeable and all-consuming. And Jane had one quality that made this idealization possible in a way it never could have been with his previous wives. She had given him Edward, his son, his heir, the male child he'd spent nearly 3 decades desperately pursuing. That single act elevated her beyond mortality in Henry's mind, transformed her into a martyr rather than just a casualty. Catherine of Aragon? He'd divorced her when she couldn't provide a son. Anne Boleyn? He'd executed her for the same failure, along with fabricated charges of betrayal. Both could be blamed, dismissed, relegated to the category of mistakes. But Jane? Jane had succeeded where the others failed, and then she died in the act of giving him that success. She couldn't be blamed for anything. She was blameless, perfect, sacrificial. The guilt must have gnawed at him in those dark Westminster chambers. His ambition had required that pregnancy. His need for an heir had put Jane in that birthing bed. His desire for a son had killed the woman he now claimed to love above all others. This cognitive dissonance celebrating Edward's birth while mourning Jane's death created a psychological wound that would never heal. And a wounded, isolated, grieving king with absolute power is a terrifying thing, especially when the paranoia began. The paranoia didn't arrive overnight. It crept in gradually, like the infection that had killed Jane silent, invisible, and ultimately devastating. By the early 1540s, courtiers noticed something alarming. The king's mood swings had become severe, unpredictable, and genuinely frightening. One moment he might be jovial, expansive, generous. The next he would explode into rage over perceived slights or imagined betrayals. His closest servants learned to read his face, to detect the warning signs of an approaching storm, because failing to do so could prove fatal. Deep depression would grip him for days at a time. He would withdraw again, just as he had after Jane's death, becoming unreachable and volatile. Then the depression would lift, replaced by manic energy or sudden paranoia. Everyone around him, from high nobles to kitchen servants, lived in a state of constant tension, never knowing which Henry would emerge from his chambers each morning. Thomas Cromwell discovered this the hard way. Cromwell had been Henry's right hand since the late 1520s. He'd orchestrated the break with Rome. He'd dissolved the monasteries and channeled their wealth to the crown. He'd navigated impossible political situations with cunning and loyalty. For over a decade, he'd been indispensable. In 1539, seeking to secure an alliance with Protestant German states, Cromwell arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. The problem was that Henry found Anne physically unappealing. The marriage was a disaster from the first meeting. Henry, already dealing with declining health and possible impotence, couldn't consummate the union. The humiliation was unbearable for a king who prided himself on his masculinity. And Henry, true to form, needed someone to blame. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill. The charges were contrived treason, heresy, corruption. But the real crime was simpler. He had displeased the king at a moment when Henry's paranoia and rage had overwhelmed any sense of loyalty or gratitude. A man who had served faithfully for years was destroyed in weeks. The same day Cromwell died, Henry married his 5th wife, the teenage Catherine Howard. The juxtaposition was grotesque blood and celebration mingling together. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, witnessed all of this. Brandon was perhaps the closest thing Henry had to a genuine friend, a companion from his youth who had survived decades at court. Even Brandon, with all his history and proximity to the king, had learned to tread carefully. The man he'd known as a young prince, confident, generous, relatively just had transformed into something unpredictable and dangerous. Every setback became evidence of conspiracy in Henry's mind. Every illness raised suspicions of poisoning. Every political disagreement looked like treason. The stress of ruling without emotional support, the constant physical pain, the damaged brain trying to process an increasingly complex world, all of it fed into a feedback loop of suspicion and rage. Jane's death hadn't created this paranoia, but it had removed whatever psychological anchor had been keeping it somewhat contained. The idealized memory of his perfect queen made every subsequent relationship feel like a betrayal of her memory, and people would die because of it. The violence didn't stop. If anything, it accelerated. Henry VIII's reign would ultimately claim approximately 57,000 lives through executions, political purges, and religious persecution. That number is staggering more deaths than many wars of the era. But it's the pattern of those deaths after Jane ceased passing that reveals how thoroughly his mental collapse had become lethal. Catherine Howard learned this too late. She was young, possibly as young as 17, when Henry married her in July 1540. The same day, Thomas Cromwell went to the scaffold. For a brief time, she seemed to rejuvenate the aging, ailing king. He called her his rose without a thorn, and showered her with gifts, jewels, and attention. Here was youth and beauty to distract him from his rotting legs and fading vitality. But Catherine made a fatal error. Whether she actually committed adultery or simply behaved indiscreetly with young courtiers remains historically debated. What's undeniable is that rumors reached Henry's ears, and the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Henry flew into a rage so intense that witnesses reported him as mad with rage. He refused to ever see Catherine again. The girl who had been his rose was now his enemy, and enemies of Henry VIII did not survive. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same spot where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. 2 wives executed for adultery, real or fabricated. The parallel was unmistakable. Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536 had come just months after Henry's jousting accident. During that initial period of personality transformation, Catherine Howard's death in 1542 came during the full flower of his paranoia and mental deterioration. Between these 2 executions lay Jane Seymour's death, the psychological breaking point that had removed whatever restraints still existed. Historians have noted a disturbing pattern. Once, Henry violated the prohibition against executing an anointed queen in 1536. It became easier to do it again. Each boundary crossed made the next violation simpler. Each extreme action normalized the next level of brutality. The moral framework that might have restrained an earlier Henry had been systematically dismantled. And it wasn't just wives who died. Nobles who displeased him, clergy who questioned his religious authority, advisors who gave unwelcome counsel, all fed the growing body count. The Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion, which Jane had tried to mediate, resulted in brutal reprisals. Hundreds were executed as examples. Entire families were destroyed for perceived disloyalty. The brain-damaged, pain-racked, grief-stricken king had become something monstrous. His absolute power, combined with his deteriorating mental state, created a reign of terror that would define his final years. Those who served him did, so knowing that favor could turn to condemnation in an instant. That yesterday's trusted advisor could be tomorrow's traitor. The king who had once been England's hope had become England's nightmare, and the ghost of Jane Seymour haunted every decision, every rage, every execution. Because no one, no wife, no advisor, no companion could ever measure up to the impossible idealized Phantom Henry had created in his grief-shattered mind. What made Henry's deterioration so uniquely catastrophic was the nature of his power. He wasn't just a king, he was something England had never seen before. When Henry broke with Rome in the early 1530s, he hadn't simply changed England's religion. He had fundamentally transformed the nature of English kingship itself. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared him supreme head of the Church of England, placing all religious and political authority directly in his hands. There was no pope to appeal to, no higher moral authority to provide a check on his decisions, no external power that could say no to the King of England. Parliament had endorsed this revolutionary transformation, giving Henry the legal authority to annul his own marriages, rewrite religious doctrine, and reshape the church to suit his personal needs. It was power on a scale that medieval English kings could never have imagined. Before Jane's death, this absolute authority had been wielded with at least some degree of calculation and political consideration. After her death, with his mind fractured by grief, pain, and brain injury, that power became terrifyingly arbitrary. Henry could and did change the legal status of his own daughters with a stroke of his pen. Elizabeth, his child with Anne Boleyn, was declared legitimate, then illegitimate, then legitimate again as political winds shifted. Mary, his daughter with Catherine of Aragon, endured the same humiliating cycle. Their entire identities, their right to exist as princesses or as bastards, depended entirely on their father's current mood and political calculations. He could rewrite marriage law to retroactively justify his actions. He could declare theological positions that contradicted centuries of Christian teaching. He could dissolve monasteries that had stood for hundreds of years and redistribute their wealth. And no one, not his nobles, not his bishops, not his people, had any recourse. The combination of this absolute power with Henry's psychological state created a perfect storm of tyranny. He couldn't control Jane's death. He couldn't heal his own rotting legs. He couldn't undo the brain injury that had altered his personality. Death, disease, and deterioration were beyond even a supreme head's authority. So he controlled everything else with increasing desperation. Every perceived slight became treason because he had the power to define treason. Every political disagreement became heresy because he had the power to define orthodoxy. Every person who reminded him of his failures, his losses, his pain, they could simply be removed, legally, with parliamentary approval, with the blessing of his own church. Nobles walked on eggshells. Clergy preached whatever doctrine Henry currently favored. Commoners kept their opinions private, knowing that loose talk could lead to accusations, and accusations could lead to the scaffold. England didn't just have a grieving monarch. England had a grieving monarch with absolute power and a deteriorating mind. The realm lived in a state of constant tension, never knowing when the king's pain, physical or emotional, would manifest as someone's death sentence. Lord Acton would later write that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Henry VIII's final decade proved that absolute power combined with psychological collapse doesn't just corrupt, it kills. Despite the black mourning clothes, despite the profound withdrawal, despite everything, a search for a new queen began before Jane's body was even cold in the Windsor vault. It had to. England's succession hung by a single thread: baby Edward. In Tudor times, infant mortality was devastatingly common. One child, no matter how precious, wasn't enough to secure a dynasty. Henry needed what courtiers delicately called a Duke of York, a second son, a backup, an insurance policy against disaster. But how do you replace a woman you've convinced yourself was perfect? By late 1537, even while still wearing mourning black, Henry was receiving reports about potential brides across Europe. His ambassadors discreetly inquired about available princesses, evaluating their age, appearance, fertility, and political connections. The machinery of royal matchmaking ground forward, indifferent to the king's stated grief. The problem was Henry himself. He would compare every candidate to the phantom Jane he'd constructed in his mind, and every single one fell short. Too bold, too plain, wrong complexion, questionable fertility, political complications. The list of rejections grew as 1538 wore on. His marital history had also become an obstacle. Across Europe, noble families now whispered nervously about the English king's track record. One wife divorced after decades of marriage. Another executed on charges of adultery. The most recent dead from childbirth. What princess would willingly step into that blood-stained pattern? What father would send his daughter to such an uncertain fate? Still, political necessity eventually won. By 1539, Thomas Cromwell had identified a promising candidate, Anne of Cleves, sister to a powerful German duke. The alliance would strengthen England's position against Catholic powers threatening from the continent. A portrait was commissioned. The artist, Hans Holbein, painted Anne in the most flattering light possible. When Henry finally met her in person on January 1st, 1540, the reality shattered his expectations. He found her unappealing, lacking the spark or beauty he'd hoped for. But the political wheels were already turning. The marriage contracts were signed. Backing out would create a diplomatic catastrophe, so Henry went through with it. On January 6, 1540, he married Anne of Cleves, and it was a disaster from the wedding night. His inability to consummate the marriage, whether from her appearance, his own failing health, or psychological barriers, humiliated him beyond measure. For a king who had broken with Rome to secure remarriage, who had restructured his entire kingdom around his marital choices, this impotence was unbearable. The marriage lasted 6 months. The annulment came through on July 9, 1540, and that same day, the very same day, the teenager, Catherine Howard, became his 5th wife. The desperate pattern was clear. Henry was trying to recapture something that had never truly existed. He was searching for another Jane, but the Jane he sought was a ghost, an idealization, an impossible standard. Every real woman with real flaws and real personality would inevitably disappoint him. And disappointment, for Henry VIII, had become a deadly thing. Henry VIII's final years, from 1537 until his death in January 1547, told the story of a slow, agonizing decline. The physical deterioration became impossible to hide. His waist expanded to 52 inches. His weight ballooned to nearly 400 pounds. The leg ulcers worsened, sometimes requiring drainage multiple times daily. The smell of rotting flesh followed him through his palaces. He could no longer climb stairs without assistance. The vigorous young athlete who had once impressed his court with his prowess was now a grotesque, pain-racked shadow. But the mental deterioration was even more devastating. The mood swings intensified. The paranoia deepened. The violence became reflexive rather than calculated. By 1546, he was executing people for minor theological disagreements, for whispered criticisms, for simply being associated with someone who had fallen from favor. And through it all, Jane's ghost remained. He never stopped mourning her. He never stopped comparing every woman to the impossible phantom he'd created. His 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, survived him largely by being more of a nurse than a romantic partner, managing his care and staying carefully out of political conflicts. Then came the ultimate tragic irony. Edward, the son for whom Jane had died, succeeded his father in 1547 at age 9. The boy Henry had destroyed Jane to obtain. The heir who was supposed to secure the Tudor dynasty for generations was sickly from birth. In 1553, at just 15 years old, Edward VI died, likely from tuberculosis. 6 years. That's all the reign lasted. Jane Seymour had died giving birth to a king who would rule for 6 years and produce no heirs. The succession crisis Henry had feared, the disaster he had restructured England's religion to prevent, happened anyway. Edward's death threw England into chaos. His daughters Mary and Elizabeth, the ones Henry had alternately legitimized and bastardized according to his mood, would have to pick up the pieces. Mary, traumatized by years of her father's cruelty and religious upheaval, would rule for 5 years marked by religious persecution. Elizabeth, shaped by watching her father's tyranny and her mother's execution, would become one of England's greatest monarchs, but only after surviving the psychological damage of her childhood. Modern historians still debate what destroyed Henry VIII. Was it the traumatic brain injury from 1536? The undiagnosed diabetes slowly poisoning his system? The chronic pain from wounds that wouldn't heal? The psychological burden of absolute power? The unprocessed grief after Jane's death? The answer is probably all of these factors, converging at once, a perfect storm of physical disease, neurological damage, emotional trauma, and unchecked authority. Each element fed the others, creating a feedback loop that transformed a Renaissance prince into a tyrant. Henry VIII never recovered from Jane Seymour's death. That October night in 1537 broke something that couldn't be repaired. And England, for the next decade, lived with the consequences of a king's mental collapse. The crown, the power, the absolute authority, none of it could heal what was broken inside him. History doesn't preserve emotions easily. Feelings fade, memories distort, and the passage of centuries can turn genuine human experience into dry academic footnotes. But sometimes, if you read carefully enough, you can hear the authentic voices of people who witnessed something extraordinary. Edward Hall was there. As one of the primary chroniclers of the Tudor court, Hall documented the events of October 1537 with meticulous attention. And what he recorded wasn't the sanitized, politically acceptable version of events. It was something rawer, more honest, more revealing than typical courtly propaganda. Hall wrote that the lamentation for Queen Jane's death was heard throughout the realm. Standard enough queens were supposed to be mourned. But then he added a detail that speaks volumes. Of no one in the realm was her death more heavily taken than of the King's Majesty himself. Think about what that statement means. Hall was telling his readers that Henry's grief surpassed everyone else's, more than Jane's own family, more than her ladies-in-waiting who had served her intimately, more than the common people who typically demonstrated exaggerated public mourning for royalty. The king's response was notable precisely because it was so extreme. Hall's chronicle continues with another crucial observation. Henry mourned and kept himself close and secret a great while. Close and secret. Those words weren't accidental. Hall was describing a monarch who had completely withdrawn from the public role that defined his existence. Kings didn't do that. Kings were meant to be visible, accessible, performing their sovereignty for court and country. But Henry wasn't performing. He was breaking. The Herald's College, the official body responsible for royal ceremonies and records, preserved another telling document. It stated plainly that the king retired to a solitary place to pass his sorrows. This wasn't poetic embellishment. It was administrative documentation of the king's whereabouts, written for bureaucratic purposes. Multiple independent sources all described the same behavior pattern. Another contemporary account noted that Jane's death was as heavy to the king as ever was heard tell of. The phrase "ever was heard tell of" suggests that courtiers and chroniclers were comparing Henry's response to previous royal bereavements and finding his reaction unprecedented in its intensity. Perhaps most revealing is the detail that Henry withdrew himself as not to be spoken to by anyone. Imagine that scene: the King of England, the most powerful man in the realm, isolating himself so completely that even his closest advisors couldn't approach him. This wasn't strategic withdrawal. This wasn't calculated political theater designed to demonstrate devotion. This was a man in genuine psychological crisis, and everyone around him knew it. These weren't later historians speculating about Henry's mental state from a distance of centuries. These were people who were there, who saw him daily, who witnessed the transformation firsthand. Their observations, preserved in chronicles and administrative documents, give us something precious, direct evidence that Henry VIII's mental collapse after Jane's death was real, visible, and profoundly disturbing to everyone who witnessed it. The historical record doesn't lie. Henry was breaking, and his contemporaries watched it happen. What the Tudor chroniclers couldn't see, modern medicine can now explain. When today's medical historians examine the documented evidence of Henry VIII's final decade, the symptoms, the behaviors, the timeline of his deterioration, they're essentially conducting an autopsy across 5 centuries. And what they've discovered is that Henry's mental collapse wasn't just grief. It was a catastrophic medical crisis that no 16th century physician could have understood or treated. Start with the brain injury. When that armored horse crushed Henry in January 1536, the impact didn't just knock him unconscious. Modern neurology tells us that 2 hours of unconsciousness indicates severe traumatic brain injury, the kind that causes lasting damage to brain tissue, the kind that fundamentally alters personality, impulse control, and emotional regulation. TBI symptoms include exactly what Henry displayed: sudden mood swings, explosive rage, depression, impaired judgment, and difficulty processing complex emotions like grief. His brain, already struggling with damage from the accident, was then asked to handle the intense psychological trauma of Jane's death. It simply couldn't. Layer on top of that the chronic pain. Modern pain management research has shown definitively that unrelenting physical pain doesn't just hurt, it changes brain chemistry. Chronic pain patients often develop depression, anxiety, and irritability not because they're weak, but because pain literally rewires neural pathways. Henry lived with excruciating leg ulcers for over a decade, every day, every hour. Pain that 16th century medicine couldn't adequately address. Then there's the probable diabetes. Medical historians examining Henry's symptoms, wounds that wouldn't heal, progressive weight gain, possible vascular problems, cognitive decline. See a textbook case of uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. Left untreated, diabetes causes serious neurological complications. It affects memory, decision-making, and emotional stability. It can cause actual dementia-like symptoms as blood sugar damages brain cells over time. Some researchers have proposed additional possibilities. Cushing's syndrome, which causes weight gain and severe mood disturbances through hormonal imbalances. McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic condition affecting both physical and mental function. The exact diagnosis matters less than the fundamental truth. Henry was seriously, multiply, chronically ill during the years when Jane died and afterwards. And we haven't even touched the psychological burden. Modern psychiatry recognizes that extreme stress, especially from childhood trauma and ongoing pressure, creates vulnerability to mental health crises. Henry carried the weight of kingship from age 10, the constant fear of assassination, the religious isolation after breaking with Rome, the dynastic pressure to produce heirs. All of this created what we'd now recognize as chronic stress disorder. When Jane died, she didn't just leave a grieving husband. She left a man with brain damage, chronic pain, probable diabetes, possible hormonal disorders, and severe psychological stress. Any one of these factors would challenge a person's mental health. Combined, they created a perfect storm that no tutory or medicine could have addressed. The tragedy is that Henry VIII was suffering from conditions that would be treatable today: brain injury rehabilitation, pain management, diabetes control, psychological therapy. But in 1537, he was simply left to deteriorate while wielding absolute power over England. A sick man, an absolute monarch, a deadly combination. There's a legend that Jane Seymour's ghost haunts Hampton Court Palace, walking the corridors where she died in 1537. Visitors claim to see a pale woman in Tudor dress carrying a candle, forever searching for something lost. The story is probably fiction, the kind of romantic myth that accumulates around tragic historical figures. But there was a real haunting at Hampton Court, and it had nothing to do with spirits. Henry VIII spent the remaining decade of his life haunted by a woman who had never really existed. The Jane who occupied his thoughts during those years wasn't the real person who had lived and died. She was a construction, a fantasy, a perfect queen built from selective memory and desperate need. Every decision he made was shadowed by her memory. Every new wife was measured against this impossible standard and found lacking. Anne of Cleves wasn't Jane. She lacked the spark, the appeal, the indefinable quality that Henry's idealized memory demanded. Catherine Howard wasn't Jane too young. too flirtatious, too obviously human with human flaws. Even Catherine Parr, who successfully navigated the dangerous waters of being Henry's final wife, could never be Jane, because the Jane in Henry's mind was flawless. She had never disagreed with him, never challenged his religious reforms, never questioned his authority. She had been perfectly obedient, perfectly supportive, perfectly devoted. The fact that none of this was entirely true didn't matter. The real Jane, with her Catholic sympathies and her attempt to mediate during the pilgrimage of grace, had been erased and replaced with a saint. Psychologists have a term for this: complicated grief. It occurs when someone becomes unable to process loss in a healthy way, when grief transforms into something pathological and all-consuming. The person gets trapped in the past, unable to move forward, unable to accept reality. The idealized memory of the lost person becomes a prison. That's exactly what happened to Henry. He was trapped in October 1537, forever locked in that moment, when the one thing he couldn't control, death, had taken something precious from him. His absolute power meant nothing against mortality. His supreme headship of the church couldn't resurrect Jane. His authority over England couldn't undo what had happened. So he preserved her in his mind as perfect, untouchable, sacred. And that preservation became a weapon he unconsciously wielded against everyone who came after. No living woman with real flaws and real personality could compete with a ghost. The haunting wasn't supernatural. It was psychological. Jane's absence filled every room Henry entered. Her memory poisoned every new relationship. Her ghost, the idealized, impossible version he'd created, stood between him and any chance of genuine connection with another person. For 10 years, from 1537 to 1547, Henry VIII lived as a widower even when he was married. He went through the motions of courtship, marriage, and partnership, but his heart remained buried in that Windsor vault with a woman who had died, giving him the son he thought would solve all his problems. The ghost never left because Henry wouldn't let her leave. She was the last thing he could still control. In the end, Henry VIII made one choice that revealed everything. As his health continued its relentless decline through the 1540s, as his body grew more grotesque and his mind more unstable, Henry began contemplating his own mortality. The man who had spent his entire life fleeing from death now had to face the inevitable. And when he did, he made a request that would echo through the centuries. He wanted to be buried beside Jane Seymour, not beside Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who had been his wife for 24 years and had stood by him through his rise to power. Not beside Anne Boleyn, the woman he had restructured England's entire religion to marry, the mother of Elizabeth who would become the greatest monarch England had ever seen. Not beside any of the 3 wives who came after Jane, only Jane, the woman who had been his queen for 17 months, the woman who had died in October 1537, the woman whose ghost had haunted him for a decade. This wasn't a political calculation. Royal burials were always political symbols of dynasty, statements of legitimacy, careful orchestrations of historical narrative. But this choice was deeply, painfully personal. It was Henry's final statement about what had mattered most in his tumultuous, violent, extraordinary life. When Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, bloated, in agony, his mind deteriorated to the point where his final days were reportedly filled with paranoid ravings. His wish was honored. His massive coffin was transported to Windsor Castle and lowered into the vault beside Jane's in St. George's Chapel, right before the high altar. They remain there today. A king and queen who spent barely a year together, now united for eternity. Modern visitors to Windsor can stand before their shared tomb and contemplate what it means. Here lies the man who changed the course of English history, who broke with Rome, who executed 2 wives and divorced 2 others, who reshaped religion and politics to suit his will. And he chose to spend eternity with the one woman whose death he couldn't control, couldn't undo, couldn't bend to his authority. That choice is the ultimate evidence that Jane Seymour's death broke something in Henry VIII that never healed. 10 years of subsequent rule, 3 more marriages, countless political triumphs and catastrophes, thousands of executions, the dissolution of monasteries, wars with France and Scotland, the establishment of England as a Protestant nation. None of it mattered as much as those 17 months with Jane. In death, Henry finally found what had eluded him in life since October 1537, reunion with the phantom he decreated, the perfect queen who existed only in his fractured mind. The mental collapse that began that October night in 1537 defined everything that came after. And in the end, even in death, Henry couldn't escape it. Jane Seymour didn't just die giving birth to Henry's son. She died, and in dying, she destroyed the king who survived her.